You probably think you know the story of the United States government. But what if I told you there was a version 1.0, a first draft that was so flawed it nearly tanked the entire country before it even got off the ground? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about today. America's first and failed government. So just imagine this for a second. Your task is to build a brand new government from scratch. But here's the catch. Your number one goal is to make it as weak and as powerless as you possibly can. Sounds completely backwards, right? Like a recipe for instant disaster. But believe it or not, for America's early leaders, that idea sounded like pure freedom. I mean, they had just fought a whole revolution to get away from a powerful king. So the very last thing they wanted was to create another one. They swung the pendulum to the complete opposite side, and that decision nearly wrecked the whole experiment. All right, so to really get why they did this, you kind of have to put yourself in their shoes. The whole reason for this super weak design was this intense, deep-down fear of a strong central government. They just risked everything to escape one, and they were not about to build that same trap for themselves. The system they came up with was called a confederation. And the key thing to understand about that term is that this setup wasn't really one single unified country. It was more like an alliance or a club. The states basically agreed to be in a firm league of friendship to cooperate on big stuff like defending against attacks. And this is the most important word to know: sovereign. Each of the 13 states saw itself as its own boss with full independent power. They held all the cards, which meant the national government, which was operating under a document called the Articles of Confederation, was less of a government and more of a committee that could only make suggestions. So, what do you think is the first thing that happens when a government has no real power? Yep, it runs out of the one thing it absolutely needs to do anything: money. And this is where that first domino started to wobble. It's a pretty straightforward question, right? But for the brand new United States, the answer was messy and incredibly dangerous. I mean, what are you supposed to do when you have massive bills from a war, but you literally have no authority to raise the money to pay them? Here's how bad it got. The national government couldn't tax a single person. All it could do was go to the 13 states and ask for contributions. And as you can probably guess, the states usually just said nope. So the country couldn't pay back its huge war debts to other nations. It couldn't even pay its own soldiers who had just won the revolution. The government did try printing its own money, but without any real power or gold to back it up, it was pretty much worthless paper. And believe me, this money problem, that was just the tip of the iceberg. This lack of a strong central government kicked off a chain reaction of chaos that basically turned the United States into 13 separate little countries that were constantly arguing with each other. Just look at this breakdown of power. It's kind of wild. The national government could, declare war and sign treaties, but check out what the states could do. They had all the taxing power, they controlled their own trade, raised their own armies, and even printed their own separate money. The national government had all this responsibility, but pretty much zero authority to get anything done. So you've got these 13 powerful states in the mix, and every single one of them is laser focused on its own interests first and foremost. Now, if you wanted to get anything done at the national level, here was the rule. To pass any significant law, you didn't just need a simple majority. Nope, you needed a supermajority. A whopping 9 of those 13 states had to agree. Seriously, just pause and think about that. How hard is it to get 9 of your friends to agree on what movie to watch? Now imagine their entire states with totally different economies and goals. It was next to impossible. The government was just stuck in what we call gridlock, like a permanent traffic jam where nothing moves. They were totally paralyzed. So let's recap. We've got a government that's broke, powerless, and stuck. And we've got 13 states acting more like rivals than partners. You can probably see where this is all headed. The whole system was a house of cards, just waiting for a strong wind to blow it all down. And that strong wind came in the form of an event called Shays' Rebellion. It's a perfect storm showing how the whole system failed. It all started with those unpaid soldiers. Remember them? Well, many were farmers. They went home from the war only to find themselves facing huge debts and high taxes from their own state governments. When they couldn't pay, the courts started taking away their farms. So, led by a war veteran named Daniel Shays, these farmers grabbed their guns, marched on the courts, and shut them down by force. This rebellion was the final, terrifying wake-up call. It sent a shockwave through the country's leadership. People like George Washington were horrified. Why? Because the national government was completely helpless. It had no money to raise an army and no power to intervene. It proved beyond a doubt that their government was so weak it couldn't even perform the most basic duty, keeping the peace. After that disaster, the writing was on the wall. This experiment had failed. The leaders realized they couldn't just put a few bandages on the Articles of Convention. The entire system was broken. It was time to hit the reset button and start from scratch. And this is basically how they fixed it. They all met for what we now call the Constitutional Convention, and they went right down the list of failures. The old government had no power to tax. Okay, fixed. The new Constitution gives Congress the power to levy taxes. States were fighting over trade. Fixed. Congress now regulates trade between the states. There was no single leader. Fixed. They created the office of the president. No neutral place to settle disputes between states. Fixed. They created the Supreme Court. Problem solution. So, in the end, America's first government wasn't just some embarrassing mistake, it was a crucial lesson. You can think of it like building a prototype airplane that crashes and burns on its first flight. It's a disaster, sure, but that crash shows the engineers exactly what went wrong so they can go back and build something that can actually fly. And that really brings us to the big takeaway. This whole story, from start to finish, boils down to a single fundamental question. How much power should the central national government have, versus how much power should the individual states keep for themselves? That deep fear of a strong central government almost ended the country back then. And if you listen closely to the news today, you'll realize that very same debate is still one of the biggest and most important conversations we're having in America right now. Makes you think, doesn't it?